WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Now we turn to a worsening side effect of the Iran war, fuel shortages. I don't just mean more expensive fuel, actual shortages from the twin blockades of the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S.'s one and Iran's. The International Energy Agency is calling this the largest supply disruption in history. And while here in the U.S. we are mostly feeling the price squeeze at the pump, now we also have Air Canada significantly curtailing flights into and out of New York airports, for example. And the effects are far more severe in other countries. Here are some headlines from around the world. In the United Kingdom, pharmacies are charging 20 to 30% more for over-the-counter medicines. And the common painkiller, paracetamol, if I'm saying that right, known as acetaminophen or Tylenol in the United States, has more than quadrupled in price in the UK, that according to Al Jazeera. German airline Lufthansa said this week it would cut 20,000 flights from its schedule through the fall to save on jet fuel. That's an NPR report. Starting April 15th, civil servants in Malaysia began working from home as a measure to reduce the demand on fuel in that country. Last month, Pakistan closed schools for 2 weeks and ordered universities to shift online to reduce commuting. Thank you, Reuters, for that story. Joining us now to explain how the war and subsequent Hormuz blockades is impacting global energy markets in European and Asian countries in particular that rely on that supply, as well as trickling into the United States, like with that Air Canada cut, is Matthieu Favas, commodities editor at The Economist. He joins us from London. Matthieu, welcome to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
And listeners, can you help us report this story? Are you being personally affected, or is your business or your employer being affected by fuel shortages? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, or price increases too. We can keep reporting on those as we've been doing with your calls. But today we're adding and emphasizing fuel shortages. Are you or your employer or anyone you know anywhere in the world being affected by shortages being caused by the war? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text for Matthieu Favas, commodities editor at The Economist in London. So let me start here. I think from what I read, hardest hit so far have been countries in Asia. You write 7 countries have imposed work-from-home mandates, and at least 5 are rationing vehicle fuel. I mentioned Malaysia and Pakistan. Walk us through some countries and how they're trying to adapt to this energy crisis.
Yeah, I think you sum it really well, Brian. So Asia is the worst impacted region by this crisis because it is the one that used to receive the vast majority, really 80-90% of the oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. And they're not getting that oil anymore, of course. And that has impacted these countries in 2 ways. They're not receiving the crude oil, which is the raw unrefined oil that they can then process into fuels. And they're not receiving the fuels that Gulf countries usually export as well. So it's a double whammy for them, which they basically they suffered from the get-go. And governments there have been really quick to react. And what they've done typically is to try and constrain demand. So to make it so that their citizens use less energy. And so very quickly we saw some working from home mandates. Some countries have cut the working week to 4 days from 5 days. School and university closures. And there's been, even some really like smaller measures, quite quirky ones, like Thailand, which has asked its civil servants and actually workers at large, to take their jackets off at work in the office, so that they don't consume as much air condition, which are typically quite hungry for energy. So you've seen a whole gamut of measures, but typically it's been about reducing consumption of fuel.
Here's an interesting one. South Korea. The government implemented a price ceiling, I'm reading, on fuel products, a price ceiling. On Thursday, they extended those caps for another 2 weeks. Have you covered South Korea? Because what do they do if the price of fuel is going up globally because of the shortages being caused by the blockades, and the government of South Korea is introducing price caps? Does that mean the government itself is subsidizing the purchase of fuel so individuals and businesses don't have to?
I think typically that's what's been happening so far, yes. Governments have been trying to make up for the difference, which means the refiners that process the crude oil, which must pay much more for their raw material, that they don't suffer too much. Their profits are not too constrained. So they've been paying for the difference. And we saw that there's a similar example in Europe. France as well has implemented some measures like that. But of course, as you say, as the price of fuel rises, the cost to the taxpayer at the end of the day is rising as well. And something to bear in mind is, when we speak about the price of oil, typically we speak about Brent crude, which is the global benchmark for crude oil. But it's a futures market, it's a financial market. It doesn't really tell you what refiners have to pay for their crude oil, which typically they want to receive much earlier than what Brent crude quotes for, which is in a month or two. So refiners, when they want oil sooner, in the next few weeks, at the moment they pay much more. So right now Brent crude is around 105, but what refiners pay at the moment is closer to $130, $140 a barrel. And that's still much below the price that refined fuel reach at the moment. So diesel, is close to $175 a barrel. Jet fuel is close to $200. So if governments have to pay the difference between these two things, it's quite a large sum.
Wow, $200 a barrel for jet fuel. Yes, I think a lot of news consumers miss that because what we hear is, the standard price for Brent crude, and that's around $100 a barrel. These individual differences for diesel and for jet fuel are really stark. That France example that you mentioned, I see the company Total Energies voluntarily capped the price of gas and diesel at its gas stations through the end of April. But that some economists are saying it's a bad idea that will drive up demand, I guess, right? Demand, because if people aren't feeling the pinch personally, they'll keep consuming fuel in the way they did before. But if the government's willing to subsidize that, so what?
Yeah, I mean, it's as you say, it's classic economics. If you keep the price down, either through these price caps, or if you cut taxes on fuel, for example, VAT or excise duties, or carbon tax for that matter. Some countries have done that too. The idea being to keep the price of the fuel down, then demand, consumption doesn't come down. So this doesn't adjust to what should be higher prices. And on the face of it, this needn't be a problem for the consumer, of course. But the problem is we have finite stocks for these fuels. We have limited stocks, and these stocks are coming down faster if you don't, or if you support consumption, as quite a lot of European governments are doing that at the moment. And it's understandable because they want to protect their citizens from economic pain, but it means that demand is not coming down, and as such, stocks are coming down instead, and prices are going to rise faster in the future.
Note from a listener as we look at these effects around the world and all these conservation efforts. Listener writes, and I'll just let this stand as a comment from the listener. Listener writes, and yet the U.S. and its government-subsidized fuel sees us not doing anything but complain, uses the B word for complain, not doing anything but complain about the cost. The question is, why isn't our culture capable of conservation efforts? So I will let that stand as a rhetorical question because our guest works in London for The Economist and mostly covers other countries. As we do continue to talk about the worsening side effect of the Iran war, fuel shortages from the twin blockades by the United States and Iran on the Strait of Hormuz, with Matthieu Favas, commodities editor at The Economist in London. And any more of your stories, comments, or questions at 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Matthieu, I want to get into the issue of airlines. One example, last week, the New York Times reported that Japan said it would provide about $10 billion in financial support to help Southeast Asian nations cope with soaring oil prices, and particularly, I think there was an airlines aspect of that. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mentioned earlier the Air Canada cancellations of many of its flights into New York airports. What are we looking at in terms of not just fuel shortages, but airline trip shortages?
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, jet fuel is, out of all the fuels that we're talking about, be it diesel, so mostly used by trucks, and then gasoline for cars, and the one that's really the most impacted, the scarcest at the moment, is jet fuel. One reason is that the stocks for these are typically much smaller. It's a much smaller market than the other ones. It's also slightly harder to refine. And what we're looking at is across a number of countries, and that's especially Asia right now, Southeast Asia in particular, but Europe, as you say, is also quite gravely impacted. And it's true of some regions in the US as well, especially on the coast. So the Californian coast in particular, the West Coast, is not connected to the main pipeline network, and that's causing problems as well. So the US is not completely immune from that.
Yes.
But one example that we don't think about very often is Australia and New Zealand, which are, of course, quite far from other economic centers, and they were the rich countries that saw the red alarm flash the soonest, because they are quite close to running out.
And I mentioned earlier, Lufthansa cutting 20,000 flights between now and the fall. Some U.S. news in this respect. United Airlines confirmed it has increased prices 5 times since the global run-up in oil prices. That's according to the website The Points Guy, which covers air travel. They write, that's on top of United being among the first in a parade of U.S. airlines to hike checked bag fees, which now start at $45 for the first bag. And I wonder if you're following this U.S. story, Matthieu. The Trump administration is signaling it wants to bail out the troubled budget airline Spirit with $500 million of government money. According to CNN, prominent Republicans like Senators Ted Cruz of Texas and Tom Cotton of Arkansas are pushing back and calling it a bad idea. I wonder if you have a grasp of what's going on there. But again, it's another example of the meaningful impact of the blockades on the airline industry. I saw one headline that said, the war with Iran is the thing that finally put Spirit, which a lot of people hate flying because of some of its budget airline features, but this is the thing that finally put Spirit out of business. So you have anything on this?
So on this specific case, not particularly. I mean, I think, for the budget airlines, maybe the situation is trickier because airlines typically hedge the price of fuel, so they try to protect themselves against swings in fuel prices. But they have a choice as to how much they hedge, basically. And I suspect low-cost airlines typically do a bit less of that. And perhaps on a shorter time frame. So that may be what's happening here. And it also may be very hard for them to buy such protection for the future because the market just doesn't know where fuel prices are going to be.
Right.
So that's one aspect. Costs are rising, and as you say, if they're cutting flights, when that's going to show also in the bottom line as well. So it's a tricky situation for them at a time when also if you're talking about long haul flights, quite a few airlines also depended on the Gulf as a hub to
Yes.
link various corners of the globe, and that's another thing that is not working at the moment.
And I said a lot of people hate flying Spirit, but also a lot of people like flying Spirit Airlines. I was just being snarky because it is a budget airline. And, it's good for people to have choices of amenities versus price. And there would go one option if this is really the thing that crashes it. Judith in Manhattan has an interesting question, I think. Judith, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. I wonder if the American oil producers they're getting their oil coming out of the ground and they're getting really high prices for it. Their costs have not gone up, and their area of being able to sell or process their fuel, those costs in America haven't really gone up, but they're getting the advantage of the higher prices worldwide because of the blockade of the strait. Does that make sense? I just wonder if they're very happy to have high oil prices.
The question makes sense. Do you have any reporting on this? Is there price gouging going on because U.S. producers can charge even more than whatever it may be costing them from the blockade?
So they're definitely charging higher prices. It's not price gouging per se, it's what the market demands at the moment or can afford or needs to pay, basically. So the prices have risen. They are also selling much bigger volumes because as the rest of the world is finding it harder to export its oil, especially the Gulf, of course, the United States has stepped in and oil producers that have exported more. But it's not entirely true that their costs have not risen. I would say it's been a few years that production costs for oil firms in America as in elsewhere, but it's true also of firms in the shale patch, notably, have risen. And also during this crisis, freight costs have risen by quite a lot. So there's been a few mitigating factors here, but the broad picture, you're right. I mean, they're making more money now than they were before the war, quite a bit more. The thing is, it's probably, I mean, it's a short-term boost, and they won't complain about that. But typically big oil firms, smaller ones as well, they like to have some visibility on the future of where prices are going to be, because this is how they're going to plan their capital investments. This is how they're going to plan what fields they're going to open in a few years' time, where to explore, basically how to plan the strategy for the next few years. And right now, volatility is such, prices move by such numbers or percentages every day that it's really hard for them to actually think about that. So even as they make bigger profits, it's possible that their investment strategy will still be very much in flux. So it's a bit of a mixed picture in that extent.
Before you go, I know you're the commodities editor at The Economist. You're not the war editor or the geopolitics editor. But do you have any sense from all that we've been documenting in this conversation, all the impacts on fuel prices, government subsidies, airlines canceling tens of thousands of flights, all of this, on the parties themselves, on the United States or Iran, for one or the other to give more in whatever compromise ends this war and ends these blockades?
So it's of course really hard to predict what will happen in a few weeks' time, let alone a few months. But it's true that we appear to be at a sort of inflection point here where we knew this crisis could be very bad for fuel markets and for consumers in our countries, and that prices would rise. But so far, we've been protected a little bit, especially outside of Asia, because there was a lot of oil in transit on the water. So it didn't show, shortages were very limited. But this sort of excess supply that we could use as a buffer has been exhausted. So what I expect may happen now is that prices could rise much faster if the strait is not open. And this is when we will see how long the governments in the West, especially in America, will be able to bear the pain. For Iran, of course, there's the blockade, and it doesn't get the oil revenue that it was getting before that was imposed. But it's a scenario that is planned for to an extent, and it's demonstrated already that it can bear some pain. So it's really hard to know, obviously, who will blink first, but it's clearly the pressure is rising for the Western countries and for America in particular.
Yeah. As a little addendum here, a text that just came in. Maybe this is a tip for a follow-up story for you, Matthieu, about people who work in the airline industry. Listener writes, the reduction of schedule for airlines makes a domino effect in the airline industry. Many of us are commuters. We don't live at the city that we're based at. With the reductions of the schedule, we have to end up spending on hotels because we need to get to our base, meaning the base of where they fly from, ahead of time, which our airlines don't cover. So, right? For people in the airline industry who may wind up having to incur more hotel costs because they can't go back and forth as easily for their personal lives. Matthieu Favas, commodities editor at The Economist, thank you for helping us document the trickle down, trickle up, trickle all over the place effects of the Iran war because of fuel.
Thanks a lot, Brian. It was a pleasure.